Hello and welcome back once again to Science of Medicine. I want to talk about neurology further and go over the central nervous system in several parts. I'm going to talk about the brain across two of these videos and then the spinal cord across one of them. One of the things that's really important clinically for neurology is to be able to understand the anatomy as well as the functioning. And so I'm going to approach it from that standpoint. We've already talked about the basic functional unit of the nervous system, the neuron, and the details of electrical transmission along and between neurons. So let's talk about the central nervous system. So the central nervous system is comprised of the brain and spinal cord, and the brain is very critical. I have a lot of functioning that occurs as a result of neurons that are within the brain. This hardwired system allows me to do things such as make sense of various sensory inputs, to speak, to move. All of those things are coordinated through the brain. Let's talk about it. So if I were to look at the brain in different sections, like I have on the picture here, I might have one of the pictures of a person's brain that would be sliced across this way, and another that might be sliced in this direction, and then yet a third that would be sliced in the forward direction frontal plane. I would see different things. One of the things that you can see most prominently in the top image is what's called the gray-white matter differentiation. And this is in the cortex that you can see in a slice that's taken about like this. And what you see on the periphery of the brain is this gray matter. These are the cell bodies of the neurons. And then you see the white matter tracts. We'll look at that in more detail in a little bit. You can also see the white matter in the other slices, particularly the corpus callosum, as you are moving down in the other views. Now, the brain is comprised of several different components. By far, the largest bulk is what's called the cerebral cortex, and that's associated with a lot of functions such as higher order thinking, language, vision, memory, movement, my sensory strip. I also have a fairly large section at the base of my brain, which is called the cerebellum, that is necessary for me to coordinate and provide accurate movements. Deeper in the brain, I have a set of structures called the basal ganglia that is also concerned with coordination and control of complex activity. But there, instead of the accuracy, it's more related to the speed of those movements. Just behind or posterior to the basal ganglia, there is a section called the thalamus, which is kind of like a train station. It's a relay section for motor and sensory signals to and from the cortex. And then the brainstem, the very primitive portion of our brain, is involved in several things, such as the coordination of and conduction of signals from our brain down the spinal cord, as well as some integrative functions that involve things such as breathing. You may remember when we talked about pulmonary physiology, we talked about one of the control centers for this being in the medulla oblongata, which is part of the brainstem. And then nerves that comprise or control things within our face, which are called cranial nerves, are also coming off of the brainstem. Now let's look at these portions. So the cerebral cortex, we can divvy this up into different ways, and you see this in different colored sections. So the first thing that we can do is we could divide it in half into two hemispheres if we cut straight down the center. And you can see that they're somewhat symmetrical, and the bigger part of the brain in the front is referred to as the frontal lobe. That's the blue section on this picture here. Just immediately behind that is a yellow portion on this, which is called the parietal lobe. On the sides are the temporal lobes, and in the very back is the occipital lobe. Now, these comprise the cortex, or the cerebral cortex, and there is a connection between the two hemispheres, which is called the corpus callosum. Now, within each of these divisions, there are several areas or domains that are specific to many functions. For example, the frontal lobe primarily is responsible for your executive function, thinking while you are listening to me speak, trying to make connections between different concepts, and also almost to where it meets the parietal lobe, there is the motor cortex. The motor cortex is involved in me initiating muscle movements for my limbs. Now, immediately behind the frontal lobe is the parietal lobe. And in the parietal lobe, just immediately adjacent to the motor cortex, this is sensory cortex. So when I have some sort of sensation on, let's say, the tip of a finger or thumb, that signal is going back and being processed by neurons that are in that sensory strip of the parietal lobe. My speech and various associations and attention are also housed within the parietal lobe. And what I mean by attention is in terms of paying attention to different input that I get from, let's say, the left side or the right side of my body. And some people have problems here. They may have had a stroke, for example, and they have a condition called hemi-neglect, which is where if you stand on one side of them, they will pay complete attention to you and understand. But if you stand on the other side of them, they will completely ignore you because it's as if you don't exist. They don't pay attention to that side or that input. The temporal lobes are concerned with things such as language and smell and hearing. And in the very posterior, in the back, the occipital lobe is concerned with sight. Now these all house the neurons, the cell bodies. The white matter or the myelinated axons will actually go deep within these structures, and we'll see that in a few minutes. One of the things that's functionally useful for clinicians is to have a mapping of the cortical structures and what they do. And in the motor and the sensory strips, we try to remember these things using what's called a homunculus. Okay, so this homunculus is a mapping that shows us where the various neurons that control various things are located. And so if you look at a slice of either motor or the sensory, you'll see this little pictorial representation that shows where things are mapped to. And you can see in the central portion of the homunculus is where your leg information is. So either that could be motor movement or sensory. As you go further down the cortex, on the outer portions, you'll see that your hand and face are all situated there. Not that you, at this point, not being a physician or a neurologist, need to know that specifically, but it does give you an idea. The relative size of these caricature kind of things also tell you something about the relative proportion of neuron cell bodies that are associated with those areas. If I look at a cross-sectional view of the cortex under a microscope, you can see very clearly the gray matter and the white matter defined. And again, the white matter is this myelinated axons that are actually transmitting signals. The cortical ribbon, or the gray portion on the outer, is the neuronal cell bodies. And as you can imagine, there are also these sulci, or these areas that are between the different cell bodies that you can see these little grooves, if you will, in the cortex to increase surface area. Now, in addition to the cortex, you also have at the base of the brain, in the, below the occipital lobe, a region of the brain called the cerebellum. And the cerebellum, as I mentioned, is primarily responsible for the control of motor systems. So for example, when you learn to throw a ball, if you've seen a young child as they're learning to even catch or throw a ball, there's no coordination. You could hold the ball up and have the child hold their hand out to try to actually put the ball in it. But it takes a lot of coordination to be able to catch a ball or to throw one. And that's learned through the brain in the cerebellar part. Now, it's not that it doesn't coordinate with the cortex and with other structures, it does. But primarily, that coordination control is done through the cerebellum. There are three parts to the cerebellum. There's the anterior and posterior lobes, and they're separated by a little worm-like structure, which is appropriately called the vermis. And it separates those two lobes into halves. Now, the cerebellum is very complicated, and I'll mention a little bit. Remember that when we talked about Purkinje neurons, that there were lots of inputs, and then there was a single output. So trying to get above some sort of threshold to be able to have an output helps with that. And the cerebellum is responsible for the accuracy of motor movements. So for example, for me to take my finger and touch my nose requires great accuracy. For me to be able to move my hand back and forth very, very rapidly, the rapidity is not done here, but the accuracy of moving it in a certain plane or something like that is managed by the cerebellum. And so when it is not working properly, we have inaccurate movements, and that is referred to generically as ataxia. For example, if I walk when I'm intoxicated, I might have an ataxic gait. Now, deep within the brain, underneath the cortex, there are some structures which are collectively called the basal ganglia, and immediately behind most of that is a section which is not part of the basal ganglia called the thalamus. And the basal ganglia has the very difficult task of regulating the speed of movements. So, for example, when I mentioned about the accuracy of my hand turning over, the speed at which this would move would be regulated through the basal ganglial structures. And you will see dysregulations in this. For example, people that have Parkinson's disease that will have difficulty with tremor or with speed. One of the cardinal features of people with Parkinson's disease is what we call bradykinesia, which means that they have very slow movements. And that is because of the death of certain types of cells within the basal ganglia. Now, the thalamus, which lies behind the basal ganglia, except for the caudate tail, the thalamus is like a train relay station. So it's taking motor and sensory signals and actually processing them down and going down the brainstem to the spinal cord, or coming up from that and sending it to the cortex. But it's not properly part of the basal ganglia. Now, I'd like to say that we understand how the central nervous system in the brain works, but in fact, we don't fully understand this. There are many models, and this is one sort of way of showing different pathways that have been worked out to date. And these different colors represent signals that are going from one to another in different directions. And all I want you to understand from these basal ganglia structures is that there's enormous complexity as signals are going back and forth and coordinating. Now, the most rudimentary portion of our brain is housed within the brainstem, which is comprised of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. And this is kind of a connection between my higher order, or my cortical structures, and my spinal cord. Now, it's the major portion where all of my cranial nerves are going to be coming off and dealing with things like my face or my eye movements. And it plays a critical role in automatic or autonomic kinds of functions, such as breathing, as I mentioned before, as well as in the conduction of signals to and from the brain.